Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Barone-Lopez, PBS NewsHour White House correspondent. So let's jump right in to this conversation that we're going to have about repairing the relationships between the presidency and Congress. So Valerie, I want to start with you because right off the bat, I want to dispel with the notion that we're in normal times, because we're not. House Republicans have been without a speaker for 17 days. And one of the things that you propose, so we're going to be talking about the legislative ability, legislative effectiveness to be able to pass legislation between the two parties, as well as Senate confirmations. And so you wrote in your paper that the simplest strategy would be to reduce the number of positions requiring Senate confirmation, which increased 59% between 1960 and 2016. And right now, I'm sure many of you know, there are some 300 military nominees that are in limbo in the Senate. And 2 picks for Joint Chiefs of Staff, including Chief of Naval Operations and top officers slated to command the U.S. Air Force in the Middle East, which might be pretty critically important right now. So are those the types of positions that you think should no longer require Senate confirmation?
Well, first, thank you, Laura, for hosting this and framing the question that way. Thank you also to the Miller Center for organizing this this impressive group. I feel shaped by the leaders in this room, the 3 former presidents that I worked for, and the very impressive people who carried forward their public servant leadership. So the short answer to your question is those are not the types of positions that we're talking about for reducing the number of Senate confirmed positions. But I want to take a step back and first try to persuade this room that out of all of the really important problems we've talked about today, that vacancies are a huge problem, and also that it is fixable, and it is at the crux of this question of the cooperation between the executive branch and the legislative branch. So I will say first, after 20 years of running the Partnership for Public Service, our CEO, Max Steyer, has been working on government effectiveness, and he is persuasive that the single best thing we can do to improve government effectiveness is to reduce the number of Senate confirmed appointees. And I'll go through 4 areas where that's why that's true. Because the system is not working for new presidents, it's not working for getting talented people into government, it's not working for the Senate itself, and it is not good for federal agency effectiveness. So briefly on those 4 points, you mentioned national security leadership. The 9/11 Commission, I don't know if Phil Zelikow is still here today, pointed out that one of the challenges on 9/11 was the fact that only 57% of the top national security positions had been confirmed at that point. In the Miller Center's oral history with Steve Hadley, he said they didn't have 8 months to prepare. They only had a few months to prepare with the people that were in place because it had taken them so long to get confirmed. And the number has grown even more than the numbers I cited in my essay. David Lewis at Vanderbilt University cites the number as 1,338 Senate confirmed positions. It's very hard to get an accurate count because the government has trouble tracking how many there are. First, it's a challenge to create a plum book and provide transparency into all of the political positions. And really, when new bills are passed and they create new positions, not all of the required justifications that are supposed to go into a central repository are actually being made. So we think the problem is even bigger than I cite in the essay. But one thing we point out is that it is taking twice as long for President Biden's nominees to get confirmed as it did just 20 years ago for George W. Bush. And that should concern future presidents of any party. And Josh Bolton elevated the conversation by quoting John Rawls in the last session. But leaders of either party should look at this situation and consider whether they will be in charge after the next election and take seriously whether they want to be able to get their leaders in place. So briefly, I know, Laura, I'm getting the eye from you. It's not good for attracting talented people into government. They're putting their lives on hold for months and years, don't know where their kids will go to school, like not able to sign up for contracts. And we know people pull out of after scrutiny and long delays, and that's not how we want to get the best leaders into government. Max Steyer published our analysis of why this is not working for the Senate either. That procedural votes, cloture votes to end debate, and direct votes on nominations are 59% of the total taken under Joe Biden's presidency, 55% under President Trump, and it was only 11 and 14 for Bush and Obama. That is not why people run for the Senate, is to make votes on presidential nominees. So, and it's not what we want them to be focused on either, I'm sure. One former ambassador I heard recently say that it's the first test of your diplomatic ability, whether you're able to navigate the confirmation process.
Right.
But whether a new president's goal is to increase representation, either from red states, rural states, or all of the other types of diversity in the country, it is not reasonable to expect new assistant secretaries, CFOs, to be able to navigate that type of process.
There's also, sorry, I'm going to interject here, but there's also the case where there are a number of acting cabinet secretaries. One of them being and acting positions because they can't get confirmed. One of them right now that's been in the news is Julie Su, who's acting Secretary of Labor. And I want to bring in Louisa, Fred, and Catherine. So Louisa, we could start with you, but the Government Accountability Office actually just reported that the Biden administration is not violating any federal law by allowing Sue to serve indefinitely as acting secretary, because Republicans have been challenging her ability to serve indefinitely in that position. How does someone staying in a role indefinitely as an acting secretary impact any president's ability to get their agenda done?
Well, thanks, Laura. And as always, great to be around a table with these folks. I learned a little something from yesterday, so I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to come to it at the end a little bit. Not fool me twice, right? So let me just say two things at the outset for a second, and then we'll obviously want to hear what other folks have to say. I came in yesterday with lots of cheery good hope about saying, hold on, we have passed a lot of legislation. There is gridlock, but if you look at some pieces, it's going a different pathway, but I think there is also places where we've made some progress. Today, however, I'm like the doctor coming into the operating room and confirming that indeed the patient is dead. I really think that the situation, right, that Valerie lays out so beautifully in her paper is very, very true. And I want to just put a little bit of a fine point to humanize this a little bit. I think we have a lot of unanimity in the room to say that it's ripe for reform. But I just want to, I truly do have some PTSD from this, right? There is so much time that is being spent on nominations. And when we say 60% of the floor time, you just want to double that in terms of what the actual nominee has to do, what the team has to do with the particular agencies. There is so much time that is being spent on this. And again, people getting stalled. And you come into these jobs at the White House wanting to figure, you're a can-do kind of person, right? You're always trying to figure out how can we come to yes. And again, the time that we have taken, I think, to get with individual senators and committees and to find how to untie this and free up nominees is just, it just takes too much time. So, and there are things like, the Marine Mammal Commission does not need to be a Senate confirmed position, right? The Goldwater Scholarship Foundation does not need to be a confirmed position. But I think I wanted to look, I took a lot from Chris's remarks yesterday to really always focus on the incentives. And I just want to say two things that sort of jump out at me, having done what you're doing, sort of your deals, right, to get done, is that this is nominations have become a kind of vice. And it is a way in which individual members can kind of get things from the administration, and also, to be clear, from their own leadership. So it can be you want to finally get an amendment vote on something that you want, and you use the confirmation process until you do that. You are from the opposite party, and you want to get something out of land management that USDA does not want to do, and finally, we do that such that we can free up nominees. It has now become this powerful little hammer and vice that is used, and people are going to be reluctant to relinquish that power. So we have to think about how do we incentivize that, because it has become a very it's utilized often to exert that. The other thing I'll say, and not to just be the bad news gal, is, we look at a lot of this as, my mom does not know who's being nominated for any of these positions. Like, no one cares, actually, very much in your home districts or in your home states. But what they do care is sort of your voting records, right? This becomes a percentage. So you're really having to understand where you have sometimes folks in your own party who want to demonstrate some distance from the president, but want to be very supportive of, say, some policy aims, but sometimes you can use a nomination vote to kind of push down your percentage. That has become a way to articulate some independence that has nothing to do with going home to Montana and explaining why this was like a critical no vote because it has all these implications for Montanans. That's not, or wherever you pick your state. So I look at those two things, and you have to figure out where is the incentive to do this. And I think part of that has to go back to some norm discussions that we've had and some calibration, but clearly, like, foot stomping on the partnership, which just is, they were just such fabulous partners, and having worked in 2 transitions, they're just the best. But I think we really have to think about a legislative strategy that is reducing the numbers. Maybe you start at just boards. There's ways of doing that. But then we also have to think of some norm underscoring. And I look at that, particularly, Chris, in the transition period, about how do you have a bipartisan process that's more with leadership, with other, you have to have, I think, a bit more of a buy-in here, and to get some incentivizing, like, you want the time back, I want some time back, I'm going to make rules that I can live with even when I'm in the minority. And we have to do that, I think. And again, the timing, when that happens, what transition, when will there be the most incentives to come together? So that was my non-answer. My answer to you is, I'm fair. I always come back. I know how good you are.
If you could, 30 seconds or less.
Look, it's so perfect. Look, I think that the president right now is acting under appropriate authorities for Julie Su to be the acting. It is not indefinite, right? You have to go all the way to the end of the congressional term, so it's not for time eternal. And I think it's important that to have the inquiry, right, and to have gone to GAO and asked them to take a good look at this, so that there is alignment and some consensus about where the authorities begin and end when you're in an acting position. But I do not think it is. I think it is an appropriate exercise of what you need to do to have an acting, particularly in instances where we are in a very constrained environment for nominees. And if we wanted something different, the Senate could act. Then you can, could force it in a different way.
Right. So. Also, I just want to encourage people, if you want to jump in, don't wait for me to come to you. I think it's better if you guys jump in when you feel that you want to add something. That might be different than your prior roundtables, but I think it'll be a better conversation that way. But Fred and Catherine, specifically, there's been talk about lowering the number of Senate required votes for appointees, period. But aside from that, how do you even address the fact of these military nominees that are in limbo, and the example of Julie Su?
I'll take it. I'm going to start, and I'm going to get to your question, but I want to start with some research.
There's a pattern here. Okay.
So I didn't do this yesterday in my first turn, so now I'm doing it.
Exactly.
I'm learning the incentives and how to play the game. But I did some research during...
You too could be a senator. That's what's happening in the whole country.
This is exactly maybe a perfect example of how Congress works and why it's not working.
I examined President Biden's first tranche of confirmations at The first 100 days, 200 days, 300 days. I looked at the 15 departments that are in the line of presidential succession. After 300 days, 140 individuals had been confirmed to the nation's top of the government. Leadership matters. These vacancies are terrible. They're very difficult. No one's talked about how it affects the civil servants. How do you do any kind of long-range planning if you don't have leadership in place? Republicans and Democrats have to agree that if you win that election, you are entitled to staff the government. At the rate of 140 confirmations in 300 days, you're never going to get close to David Lewis's new number of 1,338. That's just not going to happen. And I think that the Senate as an institution needs to understand, I wish Doug Jones was here, but they need to understand that by allowing all of these sort of actings and having all these vacancies, they're basically, allowing the executive branch to circumvent them. It's their constitutional role to confirm these individuals. And by allowing this proliferation of actings, particularly in the Trump administration, you're basically sort of saying, oh, I don't mind giving up this power. Here, executive branch, have more power. And I just think that is fundamentally wrong. The institution of the Senate needs to care about their powers. I think the Senate needs to understand that leadership matters. And if we care about executive branch performance, we need to care about the confirmation process. We need to simplify it by reducing the number that are required. But we also need to sort of all be in this together and agree that having people staffing the government makes for a more productive and better performance.
Fred, how about you?
Well, there was one president, I think, who liked his people being acting. Because if they're acting, that means I can get rid of you at any time.
You can name the president.
I think it's sui generis or something like that. Anyway, I learned that in law school. I don't remember where that happened. We haven't even gotten to judges yet in this process, which further complicates the number of nominations that the Senate has to consider. So it puts besides armed services, it puts a big deal on the Judiciary Committee. But this is where the Congress of the United States gets the opportunity to have its fingers in the action, whether or not it's to do an issue like the senator from Alabama is doing with regard to all of those military commissions nominees that are up, and that's not just folks who are going to be chiefs of staff. It's generals, it's majors, it's lower levels in the promotion process. But they are interested in dealing with a particular issue. In this case, what's going to happen with the administration's policies having to do with abortion. You add to that the fact that members of Congress also use it as a mechanism so that they can begin to have their way with people they want to have on the Goldwater Scholars Committee. And so therefore, you, Mr. President, are going to have to deal with me and put my guy from whatever county in Arizona on this board, because if you don't, I'm going to stop this whole process. And indeed, I'll stop your secretary of your acting Secretary of Labor. So that's kind of another part of the equation where you have to get into the bargaining process.
But when there appears to be no ability to bargain with a senator like Tuberville, there's a way to bargain with him, which was, yes, just take each one of them as a vote, which of course would totally bog down. That isn't possible because then it would take up the entire legislative calendar.
Yeah, correct. So you got to figure out which ones are more important than the others. But we got people who.
So there's no real ability, I guess, to then. Does anyone think that there's any ability to actually break that log jam?
He's got it. The institution, the Senate, is going to have to be the fulcrum that puts pressure on Tuberville. And he, given some of his other statements over his tenure as a United States Senator, not unlike when he was one of our football coaches, I'm not sure he's amenable to that kind of pressure. Mm-hmm. So you've kind of got those folks in the Senate as well. As long as these people at home say he's doing the right thing, I'm popular in Alabama, I'm talking to my peeps, I'm okay.
And the Senate is on a knife's edge in terms of party control.
Correct. It's very,
Is he
very,
living in Florida usually?
yeah.
One of his other problems.
Yeah.
It's like maybe a little political campaign and some ads against him. And probably, I mean, he is very problematic on a lot of fronts. And so I maybe think that DNC might be able to add a.
But when we're talking about, I guess, changing the structure of the Senate, is there a specific tool or change or reform that should be made, Valerie? You wanna-
There's a few things we would talk about. So first, in looking at that large number of positions that the Senate has to handle, Louisa touched on one of them already, boards and commissions. It's the last thing on anybody's priority list. Some of them have been inoperable for 20 years because nobody's been nominated or confirmed. Also, longstanding vacancies, there's a variety of reasons why positions might go vacant, but for those that might be at the bottom of the priority list, think about reduction for those. And finally, there are a lot of positions with layers of Senate oversight above them. And as Katie and Louisa said, the Senate's not exercising any oversight over them if they, it doesn't help the Senate's oversight if they're already, if there's nobody there. So that's one set, reducing the number of Senate confirmed appointees, but also some Senate procedures. Like 10 years ago, there was the creation of the privileged nomination calendar, which was supposed to expedite consideration of positions that were considered very straightforward. Now, at this point, those positions are taking longer than they did before the creation of the calendar and longer than everybody else, because they skip a step of committee review, but then they just wait.
Would changing that calendar, though, solve the military blockade?
So that's a different problem. And one thing with the military issue is getting to the point of, will the Senate ever change any, will they feel an incentive to make a change? You hear senators talking about hold reform based on.
And what's that?
So I should turn to colleagues who've worked on the Hill, but the idea that one senator can place a hold on any nominee or large groups of nominees,
Right.
that is a right and a prerogative that they value. The fact that now senators are looking at the situation and saying, maybe this isn't the best way to do things.
Can I put that to a vote here, just to see if we have consensus at this table with everyone? Do you think that there should be hold reform where a single senator would now, if we have the reform, be unable to block a single nominee?
Does that
Just a raise.
reform extend to whether or not the Senate has to act with unanimous consent for everything that they do?
If you
Because there's a hot set of nominees.
Right.
Because we're talking about, that's where this sort of privilege permeates itself throughout the entire Senate. Not only on nominations, but I don't want you to go home and have an adjournment
Right,
resolution.
right.
We're going to stay here and talk.
I do think that to the idea of reform, I think there are a lot, this is, people in this room have been spending and writing and thinking a lot, again, about the filibuster reform, hold reform. Some of these have like nestled strains together, but I do think the idea of some hold reform where there's accountability. It may be that you can still do that, but it means that Chris has to go to the floor, stand there, and make it such that you have some accountability. I mean, I think that's part of this issue, right? It's
Where they have to
happening.
filibuster.
It's just happening where, and you all know how this is, that, you call the cloakroom, you do a hold, sometimes people know about it, you have to go on a fishing expedition and say, is it your hold, is it your hold? So I think there are some reforms, and it gets, again, it's what are legislative reforms, what are norms that the leaders have to come together and decide about this. But the only other thing I'd say too is, and it goes to your point, Fred, is this issue of time. There are forces, and I'm without being, gingerly about this, is part of this is just delay and not legislating, right? There are some folks who don't want that to occur for purposes of advancing other things. So using some of these tools actually also take up time where there's maybe not doing things that people want to be moving on. But some kind of hold reform would be good, I think.
Chris, go ahead.
Yes, so can I add on to Louisa's conversation about incentives? So we talked yesterday about something needs to have three tests. It needs to be meaningful, this clearly is. It needs to be good for the country on a bipartisan basis, which this is, because both recent presidents have had the same problem. and we need to have the incentives in place. So I want to talk about incentives. I endorse everything that Valerie has, but I think there's a thought that somehow the Senate is holding the White House hostage by these tactics, and that's not actually the case. Administrations have got much more clever about working around this. So there's 4,000 presidential appointments, order of magnitude. Around 1,000 of them are Senate confirmed. By definition, therefore, there are 3,000 that aren't. So what does an administration do? It focuses on the 3,000 that aren't. So first, it appoints all of the White House staff, and that gives it a fully functioning White House staff, which it allows it to pass its legislative calendar, work on executive orders, and do most of the things that it wants. It can run agencies relatively effectively without Senate confirmations. Yes, obviously it would be better if they were there, but it has around 2,800 people in two classifications called Schedule C and SES, which are the positions that are below the Senate confirmed ones. It appoints them, it empowers them through executive orders, and it runs the agencies relatively effectively. So it's not actually the White House that has a problem here, it's the Senate. So they're not holding the White House hostage, they're holding themselves hostage in the country. So they're not actually getting the input that they want, and they're also holding it up for the wrong reasons, for non-competence reasons. So the three suggestions I would make on top of what Valerie suggests, which is less Senate confirmed positions. I'd allow batching. So if you
where they all are passed in a tranche or like
if you confirm someone as the Senate secretary, you also confirm his or her team at the same time, and the White House puts a team together. So you get 6 for the price of 1 in terms of floor time. That's the first thing that I would do, because generally speaking, the Senate should be concerned mostly with the person who's going to appear in front of them, which is the secretary, not with their team. So that's the second big reform. The third, there is a precedent for doing something like this, and it's called the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Protection Act, which was passed in the aftermath of 9/11, which the Senate obviously signed off on, which recommends that they themselves confirm any position in the national security area that the White House puts forward within 30 days. And I would just suggest that they extend that to every nomination, and that would solve all problems. Within 30 days, the shot clock starts. If a nomination's put forward, it's treated the same as national security ones, which has been very effective, by the way, that piece of legislation. Extend that piece of legislation to every nominee. You have 30 days to pass it.
You can't get a background check done in 30 days, Chris. That's another problem. You got to go through the whole FBI process, which...
Well, it's from the time when the nomination goes forward, it has to be confirmed, so you do all the background check before you're nominated. So that actually, that's not a technical problem.
Until Congress gets a hold of the document, which I can tell you on judicial nominations, Supreme Court once, kind of a couple of those that I did.
All I'm saying is,
where it goes awry. It goes awry pretty quickly once Congress gets that in.
If there's a will, there's a way. Yeah. What they think is that by doing this, that they are getting an advantage. They're getting a disadvantage. They're not actually getting the input into the people who actually they can have some degree of influence over running the agencies. So that it's a problem for them. If they really wanted to solve it, they could.
So I do, before we move on to the broader dynamics of the White House-Hill relationship and bring everyone else in, I apologize, it's taking a little while. I do want to ask Mara behind me, if you don't mind jumping in, about the impact on national security when so many military nominees are going nowhere. I mean, 2 Joint Chiefs of Staff members and the Chief of Naval Operations.
Yeah, Laura, I think you pointed it out well.
There we go.
Sorry.
Thank you.
I think you pointed out well in your opening question in terms of literally where we are right now with the need to deploy forces and without having the top command officially in place. And as Fred pointed out, we narrowly got the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in place and had to take up precious Senate time to do it. So we see real life impact of it. My only hope is that even though Valerie, your recommendations don't go directly to this. There's also a time is fungible. So if you can get rid of whole layers for Senate time, then it allows you more time. It's still far from perfect, but to do what Fred suggested. If you have to, take them up one by one, do different things. But there is zero question about impact on national security, as, just to be clear, what's happening in the House right now also directly impacts.
Great, thank you. Yeah, okay, great.
Laura,
So-
can I add one more point? This is Katie, sorry.
Yeah,
May
Katie,
I
go
add
ahead.
one more point? And that is that, just building up of what Chris said, is that the Biden transition team knew full well that the Senate was going to take an eternity to get their people through. So what did they do? Ted Kaufman had more people appointed on day one than any other president, and they knew they needed to keep people at every different agency because they knew the nomination process. My point is simply that when there are rules that people don't like, they figured out how to get around them. And that's what's happening. So if you have a Senate that moves like a turtle, you're going to have an executive branch or a presidency or a transition team that figures out how to work around it. Because as I get back to again, leadership matters, and they want their people in place, and they won the election, and they're entitled to it.
Okay, thank you, Katie. Moving on to the broader need to repair relationships between the White House and Congress, Congresswoman Comstock, Congressman Payne, as well as Dan Meyer. I wanted to get you guys to talk about the fact that Kevin McCarthy, your former boss, lost his speakership in part because he put a government funding bill on the floor that received a majority of Democratic votes. It received bipartisan support. And hard right members were not happy that he did that. When you look at the state of the House GOP, which as of this hour is still speakerless, is there any room for effective bipartisan legislation or bipartisan work when you look towards the future? Dan, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, we talked a little bit about this yesterday. As I mentioned, in every role I've had, it's been during divided government, so I can just make a blanket statement that's true on its face. Nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to become law without bipartisanship. There's a Democratic president. There's a Democratic Senate. So the answer to your question is yes, because if you're not going to get bipartisan cooperation in the end, by definition, nothing will pass. I don't mean to minimize what's going on in the House, but eventually they're going to, you could pass partisan measures out of the House, but it's going to get reformed in the Senate, and the president's going to put their stamp on it. As we talked about yesterday, we lived through this with the debt limit. Is it extraordinarily dysfunctional right now? Yes, of course. And this is going to sound overly partisan. There are two sides to blame here because there were a group of people who had a personal grudge. 96% of the votes were provided by the Democrats, and that's the part that surprised me. I didn't expect that to happen. I've had side conversations talking to Lane and others here, but the dysfunction is a problem. It's real. There's no immediate solution based on what we've seen in the last 24 hours. Plan A has failed, Plan B has failed, Plan C has failed, Plan D has failed. So now they're exploring Plan F, and I'm not going to pretend I know what that answer is.
Congresswoman, if you have anything that you'd like to add to Dan, but also, one thing I think we have to bring into here is the fact that more and more lawmakers, in particular right now, House Republicans are facing death threats because of their resistance to voting for Jim Jordan, who right now is the Speaker designee. And, what are the long-term implications of this, of the ability for the House to even govern?
Well, I would like to point out, this didn't happen until Dan left. So. So bipartisan things were working. And I would point out, there have been a lot of bipartisan things that have gotten done during the administration. So just to have some good Pollyannish news, the things, before the switch of
right before the House
Congress,
majority.
We had the infrastructure bills done. We had, at the end before the switch happened, we had the gay marriage bill. It got done with a lot of Republican support. We had the Electoral Count Act that got done again with a lot of Senate Republicans and even some were there any House Republicans? Maybe there weren't House Republicans there. That was actually something that I worked on from the outside. So, but people worked on that. The gun bill was done. I mean, Senator Cornyn had a lot of personal expense to himself, got booed at the NRA convention, but worked with Chris Murphy. So we've really got a lot of good members who work together on these things. The CHIPS Act, Senator Todd Young and Mike McConnell in the House. We have a lot of members who really do forge good relationships. So that is where we have the ability, we have members who are there. Who can forge something. So that's where we can get some things done going forward. So I am happy again to report that Jim Jordan still is on the mat. He's pinned down. They have some new members who have been added to the nose. But so he will not be Speaker. Democracy is safe still in the House today. And I guess this morning, some people told him, hey, if you want to stop that, you got the death threats because you didn't vote for him. But no, that isn't going to be happening. But for going forward, it is going to be these members, both in the House and the Senate. I think the speech that the president gave last night, I was saying to Louisa earlier, having been, I came from a Democrat family in Massachusetts. I became a Republican because I liked the message of Ronald Reagan. Last night when I was listening to President Biden's speech, on supporting Ukraine, on supporting Israel, that had the message of Ronald Reagan. I also heard Britt Hume say this was a great speech. So you have the makings of, old-time, Ronald Reagan fans and people who like that speech. I think if Britt Hume and Fox can like that Biden speech, and you have people like Mike McCall in the House who very much wants to, put this together, and the president's package is putting border security and Ukraine and Israel support together. That message really was a message of unity. I think if, after this very ugly chapter that's going on right now in the House is going to push people to the point of saying, no, we've got to do it. The Senate is going to get that package through. And then I think there will be some opportunity there to say, let's take what the Senate has done and let's find that coalition that unfortunately, when Kevin McCarthy did put that coalition together, get Democratic support, that is what caused him to lose, but that may be the same type of coalition that will get us a speaker.
You're talking about a bipartisan coalition.
A bipartisan coalition, because it's going to have to be a bipartisan coalition, probably, that will get us a speaker, because the crazy eights, as Kevin is calling them now, rightly, will not agree to a speaker. And I think it's going to have to be a bipartisan group, and it may just have to be a bipartisan group is going to have to, some group of Republicans are going to have to work with Democrats to say, we want to move forward with the country and make some kind of agreement to say, yeah, we'll take the heat to do this.
Congressman Payne, I see that you're nodding along.
I am nodding along and agreeing with my colleague Barbara Comstock about how this ultimately gets resolved. But I wanted to speak just a minute because, we've talked about the dysfunction in the Senate in terms of nominees, and we all know about the current dysfunction in the House. And I think there's a bright something going on that's worthy of note here in the House of Representatives, and that is that in 2018, when the Democrats got the majority, a number of young members went to the Speaker, and she was then looking for votes to become the Speaker, and said that they very much wanted to participate in a reform process because they recognized that the House wasn't working very well as an institution. Among those was a young man by the name of Derek Kilmer, who's from the state of Washington, and he had been a consultant at McKinsey and had studied large organizations and so forth. So The Speaker then set up something called the Select Committee on Modernization, and Derek became a co-chair, and at that time, I think it was a member from the state of Georgia, Tom Graves, who became a co-chair. And this was a committee different from anything else in the Congress in that you had a Democrat and a Republican co-chair. You had 6 members, 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans. You had 1 staff, not a Democrat and Republican, but 1 staff. And they were to get together, look at the Congress, and make recommendations that would then be looked at by the entire Congress. They modeled sort of a different way of getting things done. They had a round table that they sat around, not the dais looking down at people who came to testify. The Democrats and Republicans sat next to each other. And this went on for 1 Congress and was thought to be important enough that it got to be 2 Congresses, and then Kevin McCarthy made it part of the admin committee in the Congress. So it still exists, this group, and they're still functioning on a bipartisan basis, and they've come up with now 200 recommendations, a third of which have been implemented, a third of which are being talked about and will be implemented likely, and a third of which are yet to be implemented. And it was a recognition, again, that the organization wasn't working well, that it could not be a good functioning organization, and it couldn't be a good partner with the president and really take back some of its responsibility until it became much more effective. I know about this, and Barbara knows about this, because we're part of a group called the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress. We've had our folks come testify before this group. We've put some of our very effective former members together to be mentors of some current members. And this is a process that I think we should look at and pay attention to and give credit to these people who are spending time in this endeavor. And I would hope that the Senate would look at this and say, gee, there are things that we could benefit from if we did a similar thing, and have both the House and Senate have such a process. So, I mean, I think we are right now in a time of crisis in the House. I think that what Barbara has said ultimately will be the answer in terms of having a bipartisan solution to making the House function again, and I think that probably will likely be a pretty effective.
Texas did it. That's how they got their
Yeah.
speaker.
And many of our state legislatures have done.
I mean, a bipartisan solution has definitely been raised by some House Republicans and some Democrats, but I think that there is a majority of the conference that continues to say that they don't want to engage in a coalition government bipartisan solution.
I think they say that today, but I mean, what's the answer? There's nobody in that conference who can get 217 votes, and so what is another answer?
You nailed it.
Right, no, there isn't. I mean, and also, yes,
Maybe Dan
Both
going-
of those things are true. Here's
The other
the
answer is
problem I
Dan
have
going
with the
back.
conversation. Because you guys are identifying real problems that members brought up all the time. As a matter of fact, that have been tried to address. A lot of the frustration that was expressed in the beginning of the year when McCarthy was running for Speaker was that rank and file members are shut out of the process. And a lot of their arguments have validity. I mean, we got to the point where we were never doing individual appropriations bills. There was either CRs, but more often than not than CRs was omnibus bills, which were getting negotiated by the 4 leaders. And so not even the appropriations, I mean, they had a role to play to get them teed up, but some of the key issues. So you had appropriators involved, you had leadership involved, but rank and file members weren't involved. So, okay, let's open the process up. Yep, we're all for that. And the process gets opened up, and he tries to bring individual bills to the floor, and who brings it down? It's his hardcore conservatives who wouldn't vote for the rule. I mean, so there are other agendas at play that kind of belie the arguments that are made about what needs to happen, and so it gets layered and complicated as to what's really going on here.
I mean, if and I'd like to bring in William, and forgive me, Mr. McKee, how do I pronounce your first name?
Guillen.
Guillen, okay. So William and Guillen, I mean, what do you think should change about the dynamics, since we're focused on the House right now, of the House to ensure that right now you talk to a number of Republicans and they will either not vote for very conservative bills, like you said, because Kevin McCarthy did put very conservative border legislation on the floor and it got voted down. But they also don't want to vote for bipartisan legislation. They didn't vote for the government spending bill, and they don't appear prepared to vote for this national security package that does have bipartisan support in the Senate, in the House.
Yeah, and they didn't vote for any of those bipartisan successes either. Those
Right.
guys, the crazy eights, probably didn't vote for any of those things that I
It was,
mentioned.
yeah, it was more than the 8, but it was, the far right faction. I mean, what do you think could be changed about this process, given the incentives appear to have changed for a number of members?
I wanted to take a stab at actually shifting the conversation, if I could, in the following way. Yeah, but no, it's with this in mind. I actually don't. I worry that we're missing the lead that should be front and center for this conference, which is about the presidency, how the presidency relates to Congress, and what that means for the health and well-being of our democracy, at a time when our democracy is on its heels. And the question here is not how are we going to pick the next speaker or what the right kinds of reforms we should have on hold. There's something really big happening, which is that the threat of a demagogue assuming the presidency is very real. We keep saying Trump is sui generis. Trump is not sui generis, insofar as he channels anti-establishment populist fervor, which has taken hold of this country and has had a profound impact on the Republican Party, is the front runner for the next election and may well be the next president. And there's a line of people who are ready to step up and carry that mantle going forward. And the question that we need to be thinking about is, what do we do in thinking about the president's relationship to Congress in the face of these facts? Like, this is where the action is. And so part of it, like, I agree, like Valerie, like this point about confirmation reform, that's going to be an important part of it. I'd go farther, which is to say it's not just about how we confirm people, it's the number of political appointees that we make. We're a huge outlier relative to other industrialized countries. It's the number that we do, that we look to presidents to appoint. And when you think about the effect that a demagogue can have by being able to politicize the administrative state and the military, it is profoundly degrading to health and well-being of a democracy. And so part of it is just curtailing the number of appointees that we make. We should also say that what is a demagogue willing to do is more than happy to not fill positions because they're not particularly interested in an effective government actually running. The idea that the game here is just I want to break left and you want to break right misses the fact that what a demagogue wants to do is to degrade institutions, is to undermine institutions. And so that's what they'll do. They're more than happy to live with these present arrangements. We talked in the last conversation about norms, like what are the right norms, what are the state of norms. I like to suggest that norms are insufficient when you have a demagogue in office. And so a big part of the conversation we need to be having is how do you move from a world where there's a reliance upon norms to actually hard and fast rules that are self-executing. These unilateral powers, I'm delighted this next panel is going to be talking about emergency powers. These unilateral powers, it isn't just that they're problematic in terms of bad policy, they're piecemeal. I quite agree with Francis's point yesterday, which is that they're poor substitute for legislation. It's that there too, in the hands of a demagogue, all kinds of damage can be done. And that needs to be front and center. And so when we think about President's relationship to Congress, here we are, is that how do we enliven the legislative process and allow for deliberate, sustained engagement across the branches of government that enlists presidential leadership in productive ways, that don't just say, well, there's dysfunction there everywhere, so I'm going to pivot and do all this stuff administratively, or I'm going to live with a world in which I don't need to confirm a bunch of appointees because I can do all this other nonsense through other means. And so, last thing, this is a bit of a rant, but it's kind of like,
okay,
I think we need to have front and center, like, what is
Totally right, yes.
what is the big thing in play
Yeah,
here? The big thing is the undermining of democracy. That's what's in play here, and it isn't just about holds or minor changes to confirmation processes, or even today's news about how we're going to get a speaker. It's that Trump may well be the next president, and there's a bunch of people lined up. to take this mantle and to press that case forward. And when we think about restoring our democracy, it's about enlivening this democratic process and making the legislative process one not just wherein bills get passed and money are spent, but wherein we deliberately address problems that the American public wants to see addressed. And that's where I think we see a lot of falling down.
No,
The
and you're exactly right. If there's a group that, and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name of it, but that is about identifying people for a next Trump administration, and they talk about not confirming people.
Yeah, that was my next.
Well, but it's another group too that's doing that, and they talk about not having confirmed people so that they can just go in and do all these extra constitutional things and unconstitutional things. So you're exactly right, and that's why the whole democracy message that President Biden is talking about is first and foremost the most important thing.
And when I raised the House Speaker issue, it was because it is a symptom of the former president's grip on his party.
And it has been defeated. He did endorse Jim Jordan, so that is a first line of defeat. But Ramaswamy and DeSantis are also a symptom of Trump, and they are.
I'd like to take what you were talking about and go further, which is, and also what you were talking about, Congresswoman, the Project 2025 plan from candidates like Trump, candidates like Ramaswamy, candidates like DeSantis, which Heritage Foundation is one of the foundations that is pushing for this, which would potentially abolish the Department of Education, the FBI, install loyalists at the Justice Department. Dawn and Gian, how then, if the next president, let's say it's former President Trump, starts to do this, what is the role for Congress here? And will there be any checks and balances? I mean, what happens next?
Thank you. I mean, I think I agree with Professor Howell here that we've buried the lead on the conference. Once that's happened, we're so far down the road that I don't know what the solution is. I think the issue, again, is that we're not talking enough about policy. We're talking about institutions, and we're talking about reforms, and the nitty-gritty of how the House or the Senate functions in relation to the White House office. But what I see is, and I'm a historian, I'm not a practitioner, but what I see is 50 years of failure in the big picture. Not every issue, not every piece of legislation, but a political class, by which I include all of us, think tanks, university experts, Congress, the White House, everyone, have not ultimately dealt with the problems facing the American public. And then we come in and we talk about populism and we talk about polarization as though we're surprised. I wrote my first book about Philadelphia and the problem of deindustrialization, the loss of the manufacturing base in that city as a case study of communities effectively like it around the country, and how people at the local level struggle to deal with that problem. And within the context of federal policy, that wasn't interested. That only going back to Lyndon Johnson was not interested in what I described as the problem of jobs, whether it was affecting white working class communities or African American communities. And there were efforts in both. And in the city government, even the city government of Philadelphia in the 1960s, believe it or not, to creatively address that. But they got nothing from Washington. And we can play this out again and again through policy issue after policy issue. And I don't pretend to stand here and, it's not my place to say which particular packages of policies in that time period would have addressed those problems, but they weren't the priorities. And so here we are in 2023, and we're talking about the nuts and bolts, and that's great. And I think there are a lot of good ideas here. I don't mean to dismiss what we've talked about, but
right, you're essentially, I think, getting at the fact that policy and nuts and bolts can't even be changed if the federal government isn't functioning.
It goes beyond
And-
federal government. It goes to the priorities with which the political class is operating. And
So-
for all, I don't know, we can debate the start point, what I'm talking about, but I think a half century is a good marker. It
Don?
hasn't been in the right place.
So, how many days do I have? Okay. First off, let me just say, I'm the least qualified person at this conference, to be at this conference. At this table, the last time I actually had anything formal to do with Congress was 49 summers ago when I was a summer intern for Congressman Charlie Rose from the 7th District of North Carolina. I worked in the executive branch for only 4.5 years, and I was accidental in both roles I played there. But so the first thing I want to say is to Will and Gian, amen, brothers. Because I could not agree with you more, and I think that is the lead, and it's a lead that we better come to terms with. So think for a minute. We talked before about the big C Constitution and the little c Constitution. Well, the most important words, both big C and little c, are the first words. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union. Guess what? That is a myth. Our democracy is organized around a myth. Not in a pejorative way, but it's a myth. Who in their right minds, in the history of the world, would believe that we, the people, would ever have the power collectively to plot our own destiny? It was, in fact, a radical revolution when it was put into place, when it was asserted, and it has been a radical revolution for all of these years, coming on 250, let's not forget, that it has been able to sustain itself. And we also know that in our history, that myth has broken down at a number of times. A couple of times, they weren't just sui generis. By the way, we had a sui generis violent insurrection on January the 6th, 2021. Let's hope it's unique in our history. But my point is, the myth is perpetuated when the people, we, the people, believe that it's working. And it is self-perpetuating if it is working. And what has happened, I've been watching this since, as we all have, since 2015, when the sui generis person came down on the escalator in New York City. And you look at what has happened. It's not anger. It's not despair. It's far worse for a democracy that has to be built on the perpetuation of belief in something that can happen. It is cynicism. It is the belief that the whole system, I call it the political industrial complex, is rigged on behalf of those who are in it and the people who are their supporters, and that everyone else, and it doesn't really matter, left or right, black or white, red or blue, they believe that it's all a joke and that it doesn't work for them. And 50 years is a pretty good marking point, because when we look at what has happened, and there hasn't been enough talk here about economic policy, which I would submit should be what the next of these conference really focuses on. How do we regenerate a sense of growth and opportunity that actually does include as many people as possible in a world that is, and some of this was bound to happen, the world is changing radically right now. The economy, where one's individual personal role is in that economy, whether or not your children can have a better life than you have. If I could, I'm going to pause a minute. Mm-hmm. One of the things that first drew me to Bill Clinton when I was still a journalist was he talked about, and it's good because he talked about a professor of his at Georgetown University named Carroll Quigley, who taught him Western civilization. And there's Billy Clinton from Hot Springs, Arkansas, who's a freshman taking Western civilization. And this guy, Carroll Quigley, talked about something. He said, the thing that distinguishes the Western civilization from all others that have been dominant in the world is something called future preference. And it had two parts to it. One, the belief the future can always be better than the past, revolutionary. And two, that each and every person has a moral responsibility to help make that happen and a role in it. And until we can get back to having people believe that through policy and the like. So where does that lead us to government and the like? We have to, people have to see that Congress and the president working together are doing things, can get things done. And by the way, they have to see them. And this is where the problems with omnibus and CRs and all of this comes into play. Who the hell knows what has just happened, right? And some excellent things got done in the first 2 years of the Biden presidency, quite shockingly to a lot of people, and it's great that they have, but they don't see them and they don't feel them. So I will just submit this. I think the other big provocative thing I want to say, and that's the incentive here, is to be as provocative as possible. You know, we're talking about these two political parties and partisanship and all of that. I think both of the dominant political parties that have organized our lives, political life for the last 150 years, are dying. They may be dead already, but let's just submit for a moment that they are dying. They're dying for the reasons that political parties have always died in history, and certainly in our histories. They have stopped serving the needs of the people and the moment and the times that we're in and that we're moving into. I did a little math when I was sitting back here with the great and good Judy Woodruff, and the Whig Party, which you all know, kind of played a pivotal role in our history in the 19th century, but was only existing as a party for about 20 to 25 years. 9 of our presidents were either in the Whig Party when they were elected or had been Whigs. 1 in 5 of the US presidents were there. And that's because the Whigs, and they had their faults, but they were speaking to a massive change towards an urban middle class that was happening during that period in history. Our parties have got to figure out how they do this. And I will tell you, we're at, I hate to use this cliche, we are at an inflection point. This is a time of realignment. The Problem Solvers Caucus, which I'm sure, you know, causes a lot of problems for people that are trying to solve problems for, but you know. You said that, not me. Yeah, I know. But you know.
They may be dissolving.
The demagogue always needs there to be cynicism, because the demagogue wants to tear it all down. Only I can solve it, right? Only I can fix it. There's no other government. There's no other need for anything. We need problem solvers who are going to come together. And I would tell you, it won't be this time. I hope it's not, because I think if it is this time, it will wind up with the demagogue back in power. But by 2028, I think we are moving towards a new party alignment.
Different parties.
And I hope we do.
It sounds as though, I think you two agree as well, the professors, that it sounds as though the political system has to change before even there can be a repairing of the relationship between the presidency and Congress. But Congresswoman, I'm sorry, because Valerie wanted to chime in, and then Dan, very quickly, if you could.
So Don talked yesterday about being naive and idealistic, and we've asked some hard questions, and so I will naively offer a couple of solutions. One, LF talked about Derek Kilmer and the House Committee on Modernization and the fact that they're sitting together, next Republicans and Democrats working together. And I believe there's at least one other House committee that has adopted that model since then. So let us hope or recommend or do what we can to see if that type of work can continue to as a model to structure. 2, you asked, like, can we do anything to legislate in the face of these huge problems? And one model that I'm familiar with is the Presidential Transition Act, which had almost no guidelines until recently, when Josh Bolton ran a transition for George W. Bush that established a lot of best practices. And Mike Leavitt and Ted Kaufman, informed by people like Chris Liddell, have created a law that all of the good things that happened in the 2020 transition that Chris led until the election and January 6th were legal requirements to have tabletop exercises and MOUs on information sharing, and it took norms and turned them into law that are now followed even in the most difficult circumstances. And third, you brought up challenges for civil servants and and attacks on them. And I will say that every civil servant that I have worked with has taken their responsibility seriously. They show up, they sign up for a job where they know they will serve whoever the president is, and they set up programs and then 4 years later they take them down again. And political appointees have to stop treating civil servants as if they're the problem. That's it.
Thank you. Dan,
I just want to build a
Final
little
few
bit on
thoughts.
what Bill and Don said, because I agree, we bearing the lead. I'm not sure I agree with your conclusion what the lead is. I go back to what we talked about yesterday. I think the root of the problem is a polarization of people, as Josh referenced it yesterday, and a lot of people agreed with. I agree with Don. I think it's on both sides. I can talk with more, experience on those grievances on the Republican side, because I've been in a lot of rooms. But there's a perception that their views and their values are under attack every day. I mean, it's more cultural. There's not their views are not represented in Hollywood. They're not represented in academia. They're not represented in the mainstream media by a large extent. They watch late night TV and they're ridiculed. And my point simply is, until we get to the root problem of that, I think there would be a lot bigger commitment on the part of folks on the right to diversity if it included diversity of thought. That doesn't exist in a lot of these institutions. And I don't think you're going to get to the point where Congress can work better with the president, or Congress can work functionally together, unless we start trying to address that root problem of polarization.
William, go ahead.
So I want to disagree in the following way. Polarization is a very real thing, but I know how to argue with somebody who takes a set of principled stands on what the right policies are and the appropriate design of government is, in a way that is productive. And those are our standard. We've lived in those politics for a very long time. What's emergent now is the thing, Don, that you were describing, which is this populist force, which is not in the service of a more effective government. It's not in the service of, do we have big government or small government? It's about degrading our institutions through and through.
Because they don't think it works for them.
No, that's right. But that kind of division is one that is, to my mind, those who would like to constructively think about how do we build a more effective government? How do we reach the needs and wants of people in ways that are responsible and small d democratically enhancing? And this populist force, which is really anti-democratic and anti-institutional.
And I have a question, Professor, and we're basically out of time, so I'm sorry for asking you with almost no time left. But I have 15 minutes. Oh, I have 15 minutes. Never mind. I thought we had to finish at noon. Wow, thank you. That's so great. So
I have a.
Okay, I just want to ask a question, and then I'll come to you, Fred.
That is the voice of
That is the voice. What is causing, though, that belief that the institutions don't work for them? Because there are a number of candidates, including the former president, who feed that belief by saying these institutions are rigged, and
I mean, I think Dean and Dan pointed towards it. It both speaks to failures of government, persistent failures of government to meet the very real harm done by big, hard global problems, like globalization, like population movement, these kinds of things. There's been acute harm. So too has there been a sort of a cultural identity element, which is about a sense that these anxieties that are released are not being attended to and responded to. And that's a story, again, this is why, among the many reasons why I don't like the idea of talking, it's not helpful to talk about Trump as sui generis, as if he sort of fell from the sky, right? And then he's here disrupting things, but he'll go away and all will be well. He's tapping into something that has got deep historical roots and that is going to persist as long as our institutions continue to fail.
And he's not providing solutions.
No,
is the
he's
thing.
not.
I mean, it is a grift operation. I mean, Steve Bannon is just making money. He's not providing solutions. He's just he is the burn it all down person and just making money off of these things. There's just a big story on this whole Turning Point operation, which is just making it's a young people thing where they supposedly are out there since we're on a campus, like, please do not send your children to Turning Point. It's just a grift operation that has made Charlie Kirk $5 million and, I mean, millions of dollars. He has a $5 million house at 29 and 29 years old. So these are really grift operations. And if anyone has read Fever in the Heartland, this wonderful book about the KKK and the rise of the KKK in the 20s, it shows how that was all a grift operation too. So once again, we find these things where they tap into real people who have needs. It was just a whole grift operation. So that's what we're really seeing right now. But I did want to speak to another thing that we do with the former members and these groups, since we're on a campus, is we really need to focus on young people and making sure they are voting over the next year, because what we just saw in Poland, for example, where they were, veering towards authoritarianism, which is going all, it's not just us, it's all over Europe, right? And they pulled back from the brink. One of the things, when Don talked about this cynicism and the despair, one of the things that we have to make sure that I think we're all doing in our efforts here is that we do give them that hope, and we talk about the people who do care about our institutions and that we are serious about them. That's why I think last year's the president's focus on the democracy speeches that he gave, and as somebody who is a single issue voter now, democracy first voter, and the efforts that are going on now all over the country to focus on voting, because that is one of the things that Trump is also focused, that was the whole
On expanding the right to vote.
Election denying and trying to harm your votes. In Pennsylvania, Governor Shapiro, did a lot on voting now and the motor voter, and that's something you're seeing attacked now from Trump and others. But fortunately, in these swing states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, you have people who are very much invested in voting. And we have a bipartisan group of people. Actually, in Pennsylvania, Governor Shapiro appointed a Republican election officer, somebody who had fought the Trump operation when they were trying to do all the election denying. So you really do have a bipartisan effort. And I'm also part of Issue 1 operations now, which is a big bipartisan effort of former members who are dedicated to that. So I think we need to really make sure young people are engaged and not despairing, because you're seeing that all over the country where maybe they aren't as engaged as they should be. In 2020, they did get out there, and we need to make sure over the next year that they are part of the solution, not...
Fred or Don, I saw you seemed like you wanted to jump in a little bit.
So not to despair, I would go back to the history of the perpetuation of our national myth, we the people. There are lessons from our history that teach us what to do now, and I'm not saying that we're not in a horrible, perhaps even unique moment in our history. But there are things we should learn. First off, Joe Biden knows a lot of them, not small reason because he's lived a lot of that history, but
he says he's 180 years old.
Right. And I applaud what he and others, including Louisa, have done in order to help to bring us forward on this. But I think from the standpoint of policy, if what we're talking about is bringing people back to the belief and bringing them away from the darkness, we should wipe the word comprehensive from the national policy agenda, because that's what no one believes, and it's too big. We need to get back to being specific and concrete, by the way, sometimes really concrete, because infrastructure matters to people, and be as clear as possible about what the link and connection is between those things that are being done. And it's a whole lot better to do 10 things than it is 100 things, and how that's going to help people in their lives, where they live, and what they're trying to get done. And we have lost that. And so I'm going to go back to the reviled communications function from yesterday. Being able to express that, articulate it, have it backed up with the actions, because the actions are always going to be more important than the words, but you can't tell people about it without the words. And then not have it only be the voice of one person who did give an extraordinary speech last night. But one person's voice is not enough, even the president's voice. So this is where parties have to come back together, and this is why I would be more hopeful if we had a realigned party around problem solvers, maybe not that caucus, who went to the people and said, we are here to get the work done. And whether it's, I used to call myself a Republican, I used to call myself a Democrat, maybe I'll do that next week again, we're here to get this done. And we're going to do it for you. And we'll compromise too, because we don't have all the answers. And then here are the 10 things we're here to get done. We're going to tell you every time we do one of them. And we're going to actually go out and show you, once they're being done, how it's changing your lives. I know it ain't that easy, but we have to get back to that.
Chris, go ahead, and then Louisa, I have a question for you.
Sure. So I don't want to repeat everything I said yesterday, but I do want to come back to a couple of the key points. If we try and solve everything, we solve nothing. So I want to build on what Don says, which I think is a very good point. All of my work that I've been doing is rebuilding trust in government through making it more effective. Will that solve polarization and everything? No, but you go on a long journey one step at a time. And I think there are, when I think of the mismatch between the President and Congress, which does need to be strengthened, there's two ways you can fix that: by trying to constrain the President or by trying to lift the performance of the legislative side. And I vote for the second, because I don't think the presidency is effective enough already, let alone needs to be constrained again. So all of my propositions are around firstly, how you make the presidency more effective, and how do you make the presidency's relationships with other parts of the government more effective. And I think there are a series of practical steps that won't solve everything, that won't deal with all the anguish around the table, but will take the country forward by having agencies focus on delivering basic citizen services, which is what I think most people actually really care about, other than a lot of the issues we think are important, and by giving us the best chance to pass bipartisan legislation by focusing on a lot of the issues that Francis Lee raised, and also by making better legislation, because as Francis pointed out yesterday in her paper, the number of pages we're producing is the same, it's just we're writing these voluminous laws. So there are practical, implementable steps that will improve the effectiveness of government, and in doing so, show people that it's performing for them, that I think at least is the beginning of the journey towards rebuilding trust.
Louisa, I have a question for you, which is that I think out of everyone at the table, you were the one that was most recently in the administration, in an administration, and also engaged regularly with Congress as the legislative affairs director, and did help spearhead the bipartisan bills that were passed. Do you think, given your work with members of Congress, that there is a majority in Congress that is still engaged in good faith in this American experiment? Because when we talk about the larger thing that is looming over all of this, which is threats to democracy, and whether or not we're even going to have a peaceful transition of power, you were there, you were talking to all of them, working through, and Dan, you were too, but I mean, are they fully still engaged in good faith in this American experiment?
I would say like a resounding yes, right? I really believe that. And again, it's not, just sort of the fuzzy haze of being up on Congress or having a deep affection and respect for them. I absolutely think that is the case. And I think that Dan is right, is that part of this is people are not being heard. And I think that that's we have to figure out how to do that in a way. I think, everyone's saying things that I think are really kind of, it's a confluence, right? And so to Don's point about how you're reaching people and how you're telling the story, and does the bridge really matter, and how has it changed? And now your Medicare, you don't have to, $35 insulin. Like, how do you get that to people that really matter and they're hearing? This whole thing is, I have a 21-year-old who doesn't crack a newspaper. Like, it's all on Snapchat and on TikTok. And that's great, right? And how do we make that great? So it's this confluence of things, but I do think the goodwill is there. I take a lot, Dan gives me a hard time, and I'm kind of a Senate gal to start. And he still likes me anyway, and Marie says so anyway. And, I take very heartened by sort of the reporting, and I've seen it live as sort of Senator Murkowski, Senator Romney, Senator Portman, like that group, how they came together and kind of having dinner, and those conversations are happening. We have a lot of work to make that actualized and to solve a lot of these problems, but I The state of the union is strong. I'm a little optimistic. I am.
Dan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, Dan, are you gonna be?
No, I agree with.
Kill my buzz.
No,
and be
no,
like,
no,
Come
no,
on. What's wrong with you?
Your question was, is there a majority?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
There's an overwhelming majority that want to make it function. Look at the vote on the CR. If they could figure out how to tee
gain
up.
power, I guess, because right now it seems as though the minority is
hijacking.
There's a minority of the majority.
Moving the majority,
Yes, that's
yeah.
correct. Yeah. That's the problem.
Yeah. Professor Guillen, I'm just curious if you have anything else that you'd like to add, as you hear everyone talk about the potential solutions.
Yeah, I think I would sum it up, and maybe this is what we're doing, but I think we need both self-awareness of our history, our very specific history of what people in the policy world have done, the choices that have been made. And I think we need critique of institutions. To Dan Meyer's point about academia, I think academia needs more self-critique on some of the lines that you suggest. And I'm happy that some of that is happening. I'll point to a recent book by Yasha Monk, political scientist at Johns Hopkins, critiquing what he calls the identity synthesis. And I think ways that are very constructive. They're not simply hostile or simple attacks on DEI or anything else. But I think ultimately I agree with Don Baer. We are at a very difficult moment of transition. Again, college students, talk to college students about how they feel about the parties. Boy, you Republicans in the room, wow, it's ugly, but it's not much better for the Democrats.
Well, what do they say? Can you give us one example for you?
They do not feel, and there's some activists certainly who are committed, but they do not feel that the parties as they exist, as they connect to the larger political system, represent the needs that they perceive, and that they don't act on the needs that they perceive for people their age in particular, and the challenges that they're going to face moving forward. And they're looking for alternatives. And the system's not really providing it right now. Alternatives in terms of leadership, quite specifically.
Can I
go for it.
throw, just because, before the clock, the bell strikes, I want to throw out, it was articulated before, but I'll give it the pitch, which is like, what is a kind of, I like the reform itself. I also like the scale of the reform. This is what we need to sort of be thinking about, which is fast track authority for things that go beyond trade. That one way to think about how do you jumpstart a legislative process and to force votes on issues that right now are buried because the party leaders, their interest is attending to the health and well-being of the parties within Congress, is to give the president the power to come forward and to say, here's something on immigration reform, here's something on entitlement reform, here's something on climate change, vote on it. You can vote it down, but you've got to vote on it. You have to vote on an up or down basis within a set period of time. It's just something that Terry and I have written about in previous books, and we think it has the benefit of responsibly leveraging the kind of national outlook that presidents have, which is to the good, without, in the hands of a demagogue, this isn't the kind of agenda-setting power isn't the thing you worry about. Unilateral powers is something you should worry about. Agenda-setting power, less so.
You're talking about a rule that would essentially make it so this has to be fast-tracked. It has to be brought to the floor, a piece of climate change legislation, no matter.
Yeah. Who's going to be the proposer?
The president.
That sounds rather authoritarian to me.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is who's going to be the proposer on that. I mean, Josh this morning talked about the intricacies of doing a trade deal. That's something that the president tosses up to Congress and say, do it. He can send his budget that way, and they're going to say no. What responsibility then does it happen? Does it does it reside in members of Congress to come up with a process that gives this take it or leave it piece of legislation? I think that's pretty pie in the sky, actually.
Is there anyone from the audience that would like to chime in? Francis, would you, or Judy, if you have a question, you can toss it on.
For you. I don't want to push her to critique the fast track proposal. Come on.
Let's get a debate going in the 5 minutes we have left.
I'm skeptical that the president is in a position to put together the package that can pass the Congress, that the negotiation has to take place inside the Congress. And so the Congress has to play a role in working it out.
In crafting the legislation.
Presidential administrations are not set up to host an airing of the views across the spectrum that's necessary to get something through the Congress. They're staffed, as Sid's work has shown. It's executive-centered partisanship. They're staffed by their own allies. So it has to be vetted through the Congress.
In theory, though, I mean, let's just look at this national security package right now that the president has just proposed. It does have border security because he's taken insight from Republicans who want that included, including things that address the flow of fentanyl. And Republicans want action on Ukraine and Israel. A lot want action on Israel. So I guess in a case like this, do you think this could be fast-tracked? And then why would you say no? Because it has had input from Congress.
Well, if it is fast-tracked, it's because there's congressional support. The question is, with a proposal to allow presidents to have fast-track authority across the board, is to force Congress to react to presidential proposals even when they don't appeal to Congress. So
is there a reason that they shouldn't just? I guess what's the argument for Congress can vote it down, so why not just vote on it?
Well, it's I mean, Congress writes the laws.
Which is why they can vote it down, right?
That's right. They can vote it down, but why should the president be able to set the agenda? Do we want to make presidents more like Latin American presidents? Is that what we want? We want to.
I think there's a way. As the child of divorced parents, I think there's a way to bring this together. I think, but I think it doesn't have to come. I think you're right. It doesn't have to come from the president. When you talk to members, the one thing they say is, "I just want to vote. I came here to vote." And the energy in the system that is causing all of these problems, which is so real and which makes Donald Trump, a special character, but animated by forces that have been around for a long time, as somebody who covered the Buchanan campaign in '92. When you talk to members, they are angry with their leadership, and the energy comes from the people. And so if you could get them, I mean, Mitch McConnell is not a popular person, but if you wait for everything to get to the stage where it's so big, like the funding for Ukraine and funding for Israel, that I think defeats the purpose. You want bills on the floor that get to the stuff that the people care about and not the leaders and the lobbyists who are paying for them. And so I think you can get the energy from the bottom up to go after the leaders, and it doesn't have to come from the president.
William, would you like to add? Or Katie?
I was just going to say, can you talk more about sort of how does this specifically work? It strikes me as a major separation of powers violation to allow the president to, and also what happens to the committee system and the subcommittees and all of those important steps, those iterative steps that really create good legislation.
There's so much to say here, right? There's so much to say here. Here's what I'd suggest. I mean, to sort of distill. The idea that we're going to resuscitate a functional legislative process strictly by working within Congress is misguided in my view. And there are ways to leverage the adjoining branches of government, as we've done in lots of ways. That the 1921 Budget Act was an effort to look to the president for guidance on the budgetary process. Fast-track authority, as it's constituted as it relates to trade, is a recognition by members of Congress that they can't help themselves not to lard up any foreign trade bill with all kinds of buyouts and carve-outs and special exceptions for their home districts. And there's a recognition that there's certain bills that are national in orientation, that are bipartisan in orientation, that might be put forward, that we can't expect to be put forward by the majority party leaders, that presidents might play a role in, and simply say, here. And they would have to do so, if they're going to do so in a smart way, in ways that stand a chance of actually passing. This isn't the work of an authoritarian. This is about agenda setting in order to jumpstart a legislative process where, when it's as broken as it is, in my view, what we have are presidents exercising their unilateral powers left and right. And there's the problem. There's the thing to worry about, are all the unilateral powers that are being wielded. And so there's like a ton to say here, clearly. But what the boundaries are across the various branches of government are continually being negotiated and renegotiated. And the kind of authority that we're talking about would probably require a constitutional amendment. But what was done in trade policy was done statutorily, the granting of that authority to the extent that it lasted. And you could imagine other kinds of versions of this passing statutorily as well.
And with that note, we do have to end it there, so I thank you to everyone on the panel and for the audience engagement.